Greetings. My name is Mike DeFucia. I direct the Cultura Fellowship at the Martin Institute for Christianity and Culture. Today I have with me one of our Cultura Fellows, Trey Clark, to talk about his recently published book, Black Contemplative Preaching. Trey, thank you for being here with us.
Oh, thanks so much for the opportunity, Mike.
For those of you who don't know Trey, Dr. Trey Clark is Assistant Professor of Preaching and Spiritual Formation and Dean of Chapel at Fuller Theological Seminary. He's an ordained minister and has preached and or lectured at several colleges, conferences, and churches in the U.S. and abroad. And in addition to his book, which we'll get to in a moment, he has published several peer-reviewed articles in journals. Trey lives in Southern California with his wife, Dominique, and their daughter. We're here today, as I mentioned, to talk with Trey about his book, which is called Black Contemplative Preaching, A Hidden History of Prayer, Proclamation, and Prophetic Witness. The book was just published this summer by Baylor University Press. Trey, I thought I'd start by just letting the listeners in on, how I've come to know you. And I often describe you, Trey, as someone who's the most contemplative person I know. And what I mean by that is your demeanor is extremely thoughtful. I've never seen you respond in haste. I've never seen you respond with a kind of false urgency. I've never seen you respond with a performance. And what I'm learning is that hasn't just been through conversation. I've more recently had the opportunity to see you preach, and that same person comes through in that communication style, and it really puts people at ease. But it also, your demeanor, your person really speaks to a life in Christ that at least appears to be extremely stable and comforting to be around. And then I come to read your book. That same thing, what I get when I'm reading this book is someone who's really thought this through, not only intellectually, but even spiritually and personally. And that I'm seeing a contemplative vision here of someone who's really thought through things and sought to make sense of the world and reality around them in a deep kind of conversation with Jesus and with others. So that has really come through in this book too. It's just very thoughtful. So I just wanted to give, I know that's may sound like I'm being overly, effusive in my praise, but I really do mean that in your preaching, in your communication style, and the kind of person you are. And then now in your writing, there's a deep kind of sense of stability in that. So I'm grateful to have you here to discuss more about kind of the person you are and how this project emerged out of that. I thought in that same vein, I could open with a question about the book that has a bit to do with how you, I suppose, your own trajectory and your own inquiry led to this book. In the introduction, you note that Black preaching is often characterized as expressive, these are your words, dramatic or loud. And as such, little or no attention has been given to this kind of contemplative dimension. And you note also, I think it's somewhere in the book or maybe in our conversation, but I think you do put it in the book, that you sensed this call to be a preacher, but maybe didn't exactly. But there was a tension that you didn't resonate really with this stereotype, and so I wondered if you could speak to maybe this kind of tension between your own contemplative disposition and these preaching stereotypes motivated your inquiry into contemplative preaching.
Well, thanks so much, Mike. I appreciate the opportunity to be in conversation with you for this interview. And your words are, they sound effusive to me, but I appreciate your encouragement an affirmation. Yeah, so that's a good question. I grew up in a small Black church in Dallas, Texas, and a community called Oak Cliff, and it was really there where my faith journey took root, where I was encouraged, nurtured in the faith at a young age. I grew up in a church that, in many ways, embrace contemplation as well as celebration as two parts of a seamless whole. And so, while contemplative sermons weren't the norm in my congregation necessarily, they weren't necessarily completely absent as well. And then I also saw my parents modeling these diverse ways of connecting with God, engaging in their own kind of mode of worship to God. For example, I can recall seeing my mother dancing and shouting and even speaking in tongues without restraint at times as part of her worship. My father, on the other hand, was often more subdued, pensive, and in deep reflection during worship, maybe with his head down and just kind of quietly in prayer and reflection. And these experiences taught me that the spirit can be encountered in the serenity of silence as well as in unrestrained shouting and ecstatic praise. So growing up, I didn't always feel free to express my contemplative inclinations, but I didn't necessarily see it as something that was foreign to spirituality and faith, because I saw it embodied in different ways around me, even if it was just a glimpse. So I was called into preaching really by my church community that encouraged me as this shy, quiet, awkward teenager. That God was inviting me, was really actually calling me into perhaps some type of vocational ministry, and that preaching might be part of that. And so, although I was quite reluctant and resistant, eventually I did yield, if you will, to preaching my first sermon. And it was really through that experience and going on to be encouraged to go into seek further training, that I was exposed to more models of preaching and different contexts for preaching. But it was still hard for me to kind of find a place that felt like home in terms of living out my own sense of ministry and preaching. There was often this expectation that I, as a African American male, would always be loud and ecstatic and demonstrative and celebratory, and that's part of kind of how I show up, but it's not the fullness of who I am as a person. And so, fast forward, I was serving at a local church in California, and I had this friend, Justin West, who was talking to me about this guy named Howard Thurman. I'd never heard of Howard Thurman. He sounded kind of strange, to be honest, when he first introduced him to me. He said he was this Christian mystic who would incorporate silence and reflection in times of worship, and it just sounded otherworldly and kind of weird to me, to be honest. But I was intrigued, and while I was in seminary, I was in a class on different Christian spiritual traditions and practices. And as part of that class, I needed to write a final paper, and I was really wanted to focus on someone from my African American heritage, and so I chose to write on Howard Thurman. And that was really this introduction for me into what might be called a Black contemplative tradition. That there's actually a contemplative tradition that is rooted within the broader African American experience. And I'd never really focused on engaging African American contemplative, so to speak, and surely not kind of contemplative preaching in the Black church in an explicit way. So meeting Thurman was a turning point for me in trying to find my own voice and sense that I could embrace the uniqueness of my personality and way of being alongside my African American heritage on my journey. The last thing maybe I would say is eventually I was serving at a church, sensed a call to do some graduate work, and as part of my doctoral dissertation, I stumbled up on an entry called Contemplative Preaching in an anthology called Preaching with Sacred Fire. And that I'd never heard of something called contemplative preaching. And I was looking for a dissertation topic that would let me merge my interest in contemplative spirituality, preaching, as well as the Black church. And so that ended up becoming the focus of my studies. And the book is a revision of that dissertation.
Trey, that's great to hear your kind of journey to this project. It's in both the personal
Mm.
nature of it and the kind of historical encounters you had along the way. I think it would be good to you kind of described a bit about Black contemplative spirituality, but what is unique? Maybe if you could help the us understand what you see as the kind of characteristics or the nature of Black contemplative preaching in the book. You define it as emerging from a habitus of prayer, employing a mystical hermeneutic. These are all big words, and has a meditative homiletical or preaching style. Can you maybe help us understand better what kind of encapsulate what Black contemplative preaching is?
Okay, yeah, those are really big words. Like I say, it was a dissertation, and
Yeah, sure. You're
I'm
allowed. You're allowed in the dissertation to do
I'm
that.
trying to learn how to explain it more clearly, and folks in
Sure,
conversation are helping me to deepen my understanding. But
sure.
so the technical definition is Black contemplative preaching is a form of Christian proclamation that emerges from a habitus of or disposition of prayer, employs a mystical hermeneutic, and embodies a meditative homiletical style in order to lead listeners into a divine encounter that contributes to the flourishing of African Americans in all creation. That's a really long definition. It's a mouthful. Let me say just a few words about the distinctives. So this habit of prayer, if you will, is really getting at contemplative preaching is not simply about prayer as this utilitarian means to prepare an effective sermon, but really thinking about prayer as a way of being. Prayer for the contemplative preacher isn't something that is utilized just to have a larger audience or grow their platform or be known as a great preacher, but it's really this rhythm of life that is open, that is attentive to the divine in and through all things. And so the contemplative preacher is one for whom prayer becomes a way of life. It's both structured prayer, but also spontaneous prayer and practices that cultivate our attentiveness to God. Some of these prayer practices might be personal. Some of them might be communal. There are Africana kind of expressive prayers, but also contemplative preachers often engage in more Western forms of prayer as well. So that's the habit of prayer, the disposition of prayer, the habitus of prayer. The second distinctive that I talk about is the mystical hermeneutic, and at a basic level, the mystical hermeneutic or interpretive lens is an approach to preaching that really prioritizes encountering God in and through Scripture and other sources that might be in the sermon. So it has this bias, this bent toward inviting the listeners to encounter the living God through careful attention to the scriptures and other sources. So, scriptures that are often prioritized in this mystical hermeneutic are the Gospels, the Psalms, texts that are related to encountering the divine presence, texts that focus particularly on different aspects of the character of God or Christ. Second dimension of the hermeneutic is that it includes a focus on scripture, but often includes things like poetry or hymns or proverbs alongside scripture to nurture the interiority, the inner landscape of the listeners' lives and their journey with God. And then maybe the third dimension of this mystical hermeneutic is that it tends to operate with a non-dualistic vision of bringing
Hmm.
God's wholeness or God's shalom to all of life. And so it resists kind of dichotomous thinking, kind of either or thinking, and really seeks to promote a unitive vision in the way of Jesus that embraces God and God's desire for wholeness with our relationship with others, but also including with creation itself. And then that final dimension of the um, uh, Black contemplative preaching distinctive is that it has this meditative homiletical style that it often embodies. And this is probably the most obvious dimension of Black contemplative preaching, is that it tends to not be as maybe loud and as celebratory and as demonstrative, but rather a bit more quiet and reflective and perhaps introspective. It's often space within the sermon for pauses, for silence, rhetorical questions that listeners might be invited to sit with for a period. So those are the three distinctives that I articulate of contemplative preaching. It's much more than that, but those are three distinctives. A simple way to try to sum it up is probably just to say that contemplative preaching is a Christian form of proclamation that weds together prayer, wisdom, and reflection to really lead listeners into a transformative encounter with the living God.
I love that in all those three dimensions that you brought up, that it really is about stressing the encounter with God, as opposed to, again, maybe a way of provoking people, but allowing, in other words, God to do that.
Mm.
Uh, so I love that explanation. It's super helpful for me, and I'm sure for the listeners as well. Another aspect of Black contemplative preaching that I I really was really interested in finding, um, is how well these figures wed what we tend to think of like as proclamation, and then this prophetic kind of activism almost. And so much of what we kind of talk about with the culture of fellowship is how can you be a contemplative in action, and these figures are figures that, like, they just do that. They didn't have any choice but to do that. I want to ask you. I want to quote something here you said about this social dimension. You note that preachers such as Thurman, King, and Harris wed contemplation in action. And you refer to this as mystical activism, which is kind of paradoxical, right? Which brings together, or non dualist, we could say, spirituality with social justice. And you liken them to like the prophetic witness of Jesus and of the Hebrew scriptures. I love that you say this. They offer a compelling vision of the world. So the content, we could say, of some of the preaching, maybe not all of it, but it is this compelling of the world. And I love you say this, as it should be,
Mm.
in concrete steps towards this vision. Can you say more about that kind of social visionary casting, this hopefulness that is
Mm.
cast?
Mm. Yeah. So
And
that.
then these action, yeah, yeah.
Oh, go ahead.
No, and then this kind of call to action almost.
Mm. Yeah. Yeah, so that idea of mystical activism, it's not a term that is unique to me. I've been informed and shaped by folks like the late Barbara Holmes, Joy Bostick, Andrew Prevost, alongside folks like Thomas Merton, who doesn't necessarily, I don't think, use that term, but this vision is definitely something that shows up, even in something like New Seats of Contemplation. But for me, mystical or contemplative activism is really just a way of life that unites prayer and public witness for the good of others and the glory of God. So it's this way of being that integrates the inner life and the outer life as mutually enriching one another. So it's not for me. It's very much in line with the life and way of Jesus that we see in the gospel, that Jesus embodied this kind of mystical activism, we might say, not a frenetic activism that is focused on production to make a statement about our value or our worth or where we're aligned. But it's really aligned. It really emerges out of this rhythm of prayer, prayerful pauses, and then it's not an activism that is captive to any particular like ideology, political or social ideologies, but it's an activism that is really at home in the unconditional love of God. And it's from living and dwelling and making our home in the love of God that we can't help, right, but be moved outward to embody that love towards others. So that's the vision that I see in relationship to mystical activism. And I think folks like, Howard Thurman and Martin Luther King give us a glimpse of that imperfectly, but I think helpfully that can inform and shape our life today.
That's beautiful. I wanted to read one of you quote King as saying uh, he sees preaching as a dual process. On the one hand, I must attempt to change the soul of individuals so that their societies may be changed. But on the other hand, I must attempt to change society so that the individual soul will have a change. So I love that. I wonder if like you could speak, you mentioned this in the book as well. If you could draw out maybe, for example, you say you know how Thurman uses like silence and solitude as actual practices or a catalyst towards social action. How did they, or what might be some examples of practices for social action that were emerging out of this kind of Black contemplative preaching?
Yeah, great question. So, those words from Dr. King are interesting. I believe he wrote them when he was a seminary student, and it came from a
Wow.
paper he wrote on, and I think it might have been in his homiletics class, and thinking about the purpose of preaching. He would later, I think, have a more space for the role of the spirit and actually making our preaching effectual. But you definitely see him bring together the social and the spiritual at an early age. Um, but in terms of examples of kind of Black contemplative preaching and spirituality and action, I guess I can turn to Howard Thurman, right? So, it's this 20th century African American mystic and pastor and a theologian who was a mentor to folks like Dr. King and others. So, as a pastor, he knew that many people in his church, he started one of the first intentionally interracial churches in the country, in San Francisco. And he knew that people in his church were very much engaged in wanting to be advocates for justice and God's shalom in the community and in the world. And yet he also knew that there was a kind of fatigue of the soul that accompanied that often. And so, as a
Hmm.
pastor, he wanted to strengthen their inner capacity to be agents of God's love and God's peace and God's justice without their souls being ultimately depleted and drained in the process. And so, as part of that, and for also for some other reasons, Thurman actually incorporated into corporate worship times of meditation and silence, and so much so that the beginning of services were sometimes a 30-minute period of meditation and silence within that. And for Thurman, this was an opportunity for listeners to center down, to attune themselves to divine. And often he speaks about how the spirit, how God would actually minister to people in such a powerful way through that time of silence that it reduced some of the need for pastoral care. He wasn't
Wow.
against pastoral care and
He's
meeting
like,
with
it makes it
people.
easier on me. It's easier on him, huh?
Right, right. But he was aware of how creating this environment of silence was training the congregation to be attentive to the still small voice of the divine in ways that maybe they wouldn't do alone. So that's one way. You see him trying to nourish the inner spirits, as he puts it at one place, of the people in his congregation so that they can be faithful and engaged in the various vocations that they have in the public realm. That was how he spoke at times about his inclusion of contemplative practices in the context of worship as a pastor. But as I mentioned, Thurman was also someone who was a mentor to many folks, various activists, some who are still around today, and many who are still around today, like Dr. Otis Moss. He was a mentor to folks like Jesse Jackson. I mean, obviously, Dr. Martin Luther King Jr., the late Pauli Murray, and many others. And he wasn't simply a mentor, but he really practiced what we would call spiritual direction or spiritual companionship. And so he was known for creating a space for deep, deep listening
Hmm.
when he met with people one on one. So a listening to God, a listening to our souls, a listening to our lives. And he would ask penetrating questions. One of the questions he would sometimes ask people is, who are you really? Who are you really? And he would create space for them to ponder that, like beyond all of the roles and the credentials and the status and the props that we use to have a sense of worth and maybe make ourselves feel more superior to others. He wanted his listeners to really understand who they are before God and rest more deeply in the love of God as the foundation of their identity, beyond whatever props or, you know, uh, attempts we might use to try to promote ourselves in the eyes of others in our social context. So that was one of the things he would often ask is who are you really? And it was through this creating these spaces for spiritual companionship or spiritual direction that he was he's often termed out, you know, the mystic or the mentor of the civil rights movement. That he wasn't necessarily always on the front lines, but he used contemplative practices to nourish the inner life of people that he accompanied, and also to help discern God's direction on the journey towards participating in God's justice. And maybe the last thing I would say is Thurman's most well-known book is probably Jesus and the Disinherited. And it has been called by one writer a liberating spirituality. And Thurman talks about a lot of different things in it, but one of the things he talks about how in times of war, hatred can become respectable. And the
Hmm.
solution to that for Thurman is really to cultivate a more robust practice of spirituality. And for him, part of that involves learning to see people, to really see people, not as we think they are, but as they actually are as children of God. And so he talks about the love ethic of Jesus in a way that has this very contemplative feel, or we might say even kind of a aroma to it, to change metaphors. And many people in reading Thurman find that he's inviting us to expand our sense of who our neighbor is and to resist the urge to be cloistered in our tribe. And so for him,
Hmm.
contemplative practice isn't just about me and my relationship again with God or with the divine or with Jesus, but it's cultivating a way of life that leads me in community with other people. So those are a few examples that come to mind. I probably rambled too much on Thurman. I don't agree with him about everything, but he's been such an important guide on my journey that I do enjoy thinking about his relevance for today.
That Trey, that's a beautiful picture of the contemplative life, of the kind of life lived for the kind of one of the things you could say, like the invisible realities of things that go below the surface of and are always attentive to like virtue and vice, regardless of what might justify a vice, like you say. I imagine, I mean, on two fronts, I would imagine that that would be very risky business. One, for the preacher to not say anything to, in the church context, where a lot of people are coming to hear something and they want to know how they ought to live, or but to teach instead, like how to fish,
Mm.
um, and how risky, like you said, it's non-utilitarian in a way, almost like, and then in a time where someone like him would have been I imagine struggled with not being maybe more active or more out in front, but playing this more kind of this role of this is how you do activism well, or you and it. it's interesting because I was just at your fellows summit, Michael Ware, who works in political spheres, and hearing talks from that world of so in a lot of ways, a lot of social activists or political activism going on there, and the message coming from them was, we need more contemplation and silence, and we need all this. And then when I'm around people in my world who do spiritual formation, we're like, we need to actually do something. And so it's just this kind of, but he seemed to model that, Thurman seemed to model that kind of like right down the middle vision of how you do that well. And you paint a beautiful picture of what that looks like, through just teaching us about his own life in ministry. Um, I I also want to talk about Barbara Harris because you seem to have this fondness for her that comes through in the book, and I have a question that's personal and maybe completely off, but I did want to just ask, like, because um, I wonder, like, I thought that it was cute in the book how you were like you really wondered if she was a whooper. And I wanted to know, like, if that's because of maybe these three exemplars that she was the least demonstrative. At least that's what came through to me. Did you feel a special connection to her for that reason, or am I reading way too much into this?
No, it's a good question. So, for those who might not know, Bishop Barbara Harris was the first woman ordained to be a bishop in the Anglican Communion. She was an Episcopal priest and advocate for justice. Marched with Martin Luther King Jr. during the Civil Rights Movement in the 60s, and so she was really a pioneer in so many different ways. When I One of the reasons I was quite drawn to her is partly because she's the only figure that I actually had a chance to engage conversation with in terms of the three main people that I looked at in the book: Howard Thurman, Martin Luther King Jr., and then Barbara Harris. So it was special to be able to have phone calls with her and interview her, meet with her in her home in Boston before she passed. I didn't know her well, but in the brief period that I did have a chance to interact with her, I was just so struck by her as a kind of ordinary contemplative, but one that challenged my imagination of what a contemplative can be. She was very witty and funny and down to earth, and was committed to speaking truth to love and being an advocate for the least, the last, and the lost. She is in the obviously part of the Episcopal Church, which is a broad stereotype, but preaching in the Episcopal Church tends to not be known for being very demonstrative. I think most would agree with that. There are exceptions, right? Bishop Michael Curry and others who are known for being maybe more demonstrative preachers in the Episcopal Church. But she was someone who I saw engaging in a kind of mixed preaching that brought together head and heart, and she did this while facing unique challenges as a woman who was called to ministry in a very male-centered context and world. And so she was navigating the politics and the challenges of that in some really courageous ways throughout her life and her ministry. It was an honor to be able to learn from her and to sit at her feet for a little bit. And because not much has been written on her, it was one of the harder chapters to write, just in terms of gathering data. And I really wanted to make sure that I didn't misrepresent her. And so part of it was like interviewing her and having conversations and trying to make sure that I did my best to reflect her sense of her preaching vocation and call.
Well, that I specifically remember that chapter well because it was so personal. Like, it really spoke of this fondness that you had for her, and how meaningful that conversation was for you. It really came through in the book for sure.
Well, thanks for
Uh,
sharing that. I
yeah,
appreciate it. She
yeah,
passed
yeah.
away right in the midst of when I was writing her chapter, and so she was eager
Oh
to see the
wow.
final result. But she passed away. I
Oh,
think it was in 2020. around March, if I'm
Okay.
not mistaken.
Okay. Wow. Yeah, what a gift to have that time with her.
Absolutely.
Yeah. One of the other questions, continuing kind of in this contemplative active thing, in the one of the themes or motifs that you point to in the penultimate chapter is this motif of an ascent and a descent, or you can call it a contemplative prophetic, kind of the things we've been talking about. How contemplation is sort of lived out
Hmm.
in this kind of ethical demand of that it placed on us. We've also been kind of emailing on this. We had this talk with a guy named Ron Dart a couple of weeks back, and he has a book that talks about the Beatitudes, kind of being like Jesus's way of saying, like, this is how this unfolds. Like,
Hmm.
you know, you have this interior life with God, but you move into persecution as you go to love your neighbor and even your enemies. Can you say more about that ascent descent motif that you've kind of drawn out of these? And in a sense, I don't want to say you're summarizing it, but as the penultimate chapter, it did feel like this is something you wanted to focus on, and maybe why was that, or what was important about that to you?
Yeah, that's a good question. Yeah, I don't know if I necessarily intentionally tried to bring out that motif, but I focus on two preachers who preached a sermon on transfiguration
Mm-hmm.
Sunday, I believe, and both of them deal with the text in the Gospels on the transfiguration. And as part of that, they talked about this ascent and descent rhythm as crucial to our life with Jesus. And the mountain top being this place where we often receive vision and direction. And yet we have this temptation to want to cling to the mountaintop experiences, to hold on to them. And yet the Spirit beckons us to go down into the valley, to integrate the fruits of our contemplation into our life, especially for the most in need around us. And then there's something about being in the valley, I would say, in Black contemplative spirituality, that can also be this place of vision. That suffering is not does not um, prevent us from seeing the divine, but Thurman talks about a kind of luminous darkness that even in the dark there's divine disclosure as we learn of the God who is with us in our pain, in our suffering, in our loss. So I think that you do see them held in intention, and both are in many ways needed for some of the contemplative preachers that I look at, and they're just taking their cue, seeing the rhythm again in Jesus's life
Mm-hmm.
of mountaintop and valley, of ascent and descent, of uniting together contemplation and action as a seamless part of a whole life that is given over into discipleship in Jesus.
Wow. You know, it makes me think in hearing you talk about Black contemplative preaching in these figures that they really display a kind of spirituality that, if you think in terms of the mansions or the John of the Cross stuff, or Richard Rohr's like idea of the second, it's all the same thing, right?
Mm.
That the spirituality becomes much more almost like about establishing a kind of deep internal sense of
Mm.
abiding presence that one takes with them. It becomes a little less active in the sense that, like you said, that when that activism can kind of get us, that active urge can get us in trouble. But it's a more balanced kind of vision that I'm hearing come through that.
Mm.
And as you do in early chapters, you kind of you knit this vision into the kind of history of contemplation.
Mm.
And so I'm really hearing that come through in this. You open and close the book by really stressing that Black contemplative preaching can speak to contemporary issues of our time, particularly fragmentation, fear, and fatigue. I wanted to give you a chance to speak to how you see it addressing those issues or speaking to those issues, and then maybe anything else that comes to mind that you hope folks would glean from this book and from Black contemplative preaching more generally.
Mm. Yeah, it's a good question. Yeah, I mean, I think all of those issues are in many ways perennial, right? Just the fear, uncertainty of the present and the future as it unfolds, the fragmentation and division and divisiveness that we experience socially and politically, and then just the pace of life in late modernity leaves so many of us exhausted, and struggling to be where our bodies are. Um, and so I think the vision that emerges from many of these contemplative preachers is of a way of life that entrusts ourselves to a God who holds us in the darkest of moments. I think of Dr. Martin Luther King Jr. sermon, Our God is Able, receiving bomb threats, right? Death threats on his life and on his family, and having this mystical moment at his kitchen table of entrusting himself to the divine in the lowest part of his life, right? So, what does it mean to give ourselves over, to entrust ourselves to God? Not in a way that closes our eyes to the suffering and the challenges around us, but actually attunes ourselves to the divine in and through the suffering we might experience so that we might find hope. And then, in terms of that fragmentation and division, I think what we see in Thurman's life, what we see in King, and what we see in Barbara Harris, I mean, they lived through intense racism and segregation and sexism, structurally, personally. They experienced all of these things. And yet they all embody this kind of holistic vision of community, that Thurman would say all of life is one, that I can never be who I'm meant to be by diminishing who you are, that we are actually caught in this network of mutuality, is the language that Dr. King would speak of. And so I think they provide a vision that refuses a kind of lazy othering of people around us,
Mm-hmm.
and an invitation to see others' humanity as intricately connected, interconnected with our own humanity as children who are created by God in the image of God. And then in terms of that last piece of just the fatigue, right? The fatigue of the soul, right? As some authors talk about, is so prevalent among many of us as we in Western society, especially as we seek to keep up pace with others, to outdo ourselves so that we can feel superior to others, and these are all these ways in which we get trapped in cycles that deplete our inner life and lead us in places that are barren of awareness of the divine. And so Thurman especially invites us to cultivate rhythms in our life that sustain us, so that we can be faithful to our varied vocations. He resists a kind of one size fit all spirituality, but is sensitive to the ways in which all of us must be discerning in finding the habits, the practices, and the relationships that can invite us into a way of life that is centered, that is grounded, that is sustainable in the midst of the challenges and the demands of our the velocity of our society, the speed of our society. So those are different ways that I think these contemplative leaders and preachers speak to some of the issues for today. If I had to say maybe one final thing, that in terms of takeaways, for me in my own journey with Jesus, it was really meaningful to be able to engage this cloud of witnesses, if you will, who are often neglected, or who are often maybe even erased. I love learning from various folks in the Western contemplative spiritual tradition, but those who are often lifted up are not of my particular ethnic heritage. And so it can give the impression that we actually don't have any spiritual heroes and sheroes, that there actually isn't spiritual wisdom that we offer, which is, of course, false. And so this project for me was an opportunity to go deeper in learning about contemplatives within the Black church tradition. Other folks have done really important work on this, like Barbara Holmes, obviously, and Barbara Peacock and Dr. Barbara Peacock and others. But this project expanded my horizon and introduced me to some new folks and gave me an appreciation for the contemplative wisdom in the Black church. And I hope that folks who might check out the book would also learn from the contemplative wisdom of people in the past and in the present who are part of the Black church tradition.
Trey, you've certainly, in some ways, done justice to these figures by
No.
pointing to in drawing this out. Right? I
Mm,
mean, it's a beautiful thing. It's such an incredible witness. I don't want to say resource, like you said, cloud of witnesses.
mm,
That I really do think it has been tremendously formative for me to read about
mm,
and work through stuff that I've been wrestling with. That again, without knowing you, without having access to this, and how articulate the book works through these figures in this kind of mode of life, way of life that they're living, super impactful. So that's my plug for the book, but it is great, and it's very accessible too. Even though it's a dissertation, right? It's very accessible. You've done a good job making it very accessible. And speaking of books, one thing I wanted to ask you is what is next for you? Do you have any projects you're working on right now? Like, what's the next? Since we always are rushing and in a hurry and to produce. What might be next for you?
yeah, yeah. Learning to rest, learning to be in a state of not constant production is part of what I'm learning, trying to learn. I'm not there. Um, but yeah, I think along with that, I am working on two primary book projects. One is an edited volume on Howard Thurman, looking at contributions of his preaching and liturgy and their implications for today. And that's a book that I'm editing with a colleague at Fuller, Jennifer Ackerman, and then also a colleague at Duke Divinity, Luke Powery. And then the other book project that I'm working on is looking at various streams of spirituality or traditions of spirituality in the Black church. So Richard Foster helpfully and famously spoke about the different streams of living water, looking at different traditions of spirituality in the Western church in general. So this book builds off of his work, as well as folks like Shel Sanders and Robert Franklin, to think about different streams or traditions of spirituality in the Black church in particular. Who were some exemplars and practices in these varied different streams, whether in the contemplative stream or the holiness stream or the womanish stream. So that's a project I'm currently working on, and I'm grateful for the support that I've been able to receive from the Martin Institute as I work on that project.
We're just grateful to know you and get to read this stuff when it's all done. Um, Last thing I wanted to ask you, well, to plug the Black Contemplative Society.
Mm.
For those of you who don't know, Trey is the co-founder of the Black Contemplative Society. Can you tell listeners a little bit about that?
Yeah, I guess the short version is I teach a course on African American Christian spirituality at Fuller, and when we were finishing up the course, was interested if some students might want to continue to explore some of the wisdom of various Black contemplatives, and some were interested, and so we kind of collaborated to start this small community that seeks to elevate and engage the voices of Black contemplatives for the good of the church and the glory of God. And so our hope is really to make more to raise awareness around various contemplative resources, exemplars within the Black church that can enrich and inform our spiritual life today. And we do that through mainly curating various resources and opportunities, whether there's our upcoming events, sometimes there's lectures, sometimes there are um, uh, gatherings that are taking place focused on the contemplative wisdom of Black folks. There's a group called a class called Black Lives and Contemplation through the Center for Spiritual Imagination, and so we try to highlight their important work. Josue Perea is the one who coordinates and leads that class, and so we connect with him and also others who are just doing some really great work. Tia Norman is someone who's organizing the first Black Contemplative Prayer Summit next year. And so we like to highlight some of the amazing work that's been done so that folks who are interested in learning more of the contemplative wisdom of folks of African descent can do that. We also host various book clubs periodically. We have one that's starting in a couple of weeks. That's, I think, about a 6-week book club. Just a time in community virtually to walk through a book prayerfully and thoughtfully and think about its implications for our life. And all the books that we focus on at this point are by various Black contemplatives, whether in the past or in the present.
And where can one go to find, or what the URL for that
I think
is?
the URL is Black Contemplative Society.
But if they just Google maybe that, they could also find that too. Sorry, yeah, I interrupted you, but
No, 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 no.
blackcontemplativesociety.org maybe, or com, or
Yes, I think it's blackcontemplativesociety.org.
okay, okay, or just Google it, and
You
like
could
I
just
know
Google
when I do, it comes right up.
right.
Yeah, yeah, awesome, awesome. Well, I want to close out by reading just um, a paragraph from your book that I think really summarizes, if you don't mind, if you don't mind me reading your work. Uh, Blackness is not bounded. The overlooked tradition of contemplative preaching in the Black church witnesses to this fact. It is a diverse, boundary crossing tradition of proclamation that unites head and heart, spirituality, and social engagement as it draws people toward a formative encounter with the living God in radical reconciliation with all of creation. For Black contemplative preachers, the world is a cloister through which prayerful reflection, proclamation, and engagement with God, God's world, emerges. As such, they reflect a more expansive kind of activism than is often recognized in the Black church, a tradition that continues today. Troy, thank you so much for being with us. Troy, I was just with a friend named Troy. Trey, thank
I
you so
got you.
much
I
for
got
being with us. I'm again plugging the book, Black
you.
Contemplative Preaching, Baylor University Press. I know you can get this on Amazon through Baylor Press. But again, Troy, thank you for sharing, for your hard work on this, and for being here with us today.
Mike, thank you so much for your generosity and reaching out and for being willing to let me have this conversation with you. It was really a pleasure. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Trey. It's so good to be with you.